My dear dreamers, welcome back to Sleepy Story Haven, your refuge at the edge of the day, where the hours soften and the mind is finally, graciously, given permission to rest. Tonight, we are going somewhere gentle. Somewhere that smells of crushed wildflowers and old stone, and where the wind has a certain quality, unhurried, as though it, too, has learned that not everything worth doing must be done quickly. I've always been drawn to stories about the things that wait. Not in dread, not in tension, but simply, in patience. There is something quietly profound about the notion that wisdom, real wisdom, does not rush. That the oldest and deepest things in any world are the ones most likely to be found sitting very, very still. We live in an age that has mistaken motion for meaning. But tonight's story gently, beautifully, pushes back against that. What you're about to hear is an original tale, written for listeners like you, thoughtful people who know that a story can be both a lullaby and a lantern. Something that soothes you into rest while also leaving a small, steady light burning somewhere behind your eyes. So I want you to close your eyes, if you'd like. Or let your gaze go soft and unfocused, resting on the middle distance. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day begin, just slowly, to lift. Imagine a hill. A rounded, gentle hill, the sort that seems almost too perfectly shaped to be entirely natural. And covering it, from its broad base to its modest crown, are dandelions. Not the scraggly, pavement-cracked kind, but full, golden-headed, impossibly cheerful dandelions, swaying in a breeze that smells faintly of warmth and time. At the top of that hill, something enormous sleeps. Has slept, in fact, for longer than anyone in the valley below can properly remember. This is that creature's story. And, I think you'll find, it is also yours. The Sleepy Dragon of Dandelion Hill. The town of Millhaven had, as most towns of its particular age and temperament do, a great many traditions that had long since outlived their original meaning. There was the bread blessing on the first morning of every new season, for instance, a ceremony that had once involved an entire day of communal baking and the earnest distribution of loaves to those without hearth or hearth companion. By the time Lyra Voss came of age, it had been reduced to the baker setting out 3 small rolls on the steps of the market hall, which the sparrows inevitably claimed before any official could arrive to officially claim them first. No one seemed troubled by this. The ceremony continued, the sparrows grew robust and confident, and the town retained its comfortable sense of having honored something. Then there was the midnight bell, which had once called the night watch to their rounds, and now merely woke old Hennert the weaver at an inconvenient hour 3 times per week, for which he had not forgiven the alderman, or any alderman since, and said so regularly and with considerable creativity of language. And then there was the Dragon Warden. Lyra had inherited the title in the ordinary, unheroic way one inherits most things of moderate embarrassment, through the simple, unavoidable mechanics of being the last in a family line that had once signed something official. Her grandmother had held the title before her, and her grandmother's mother before that, stretching back through a succession of Voss women who were, by all accounts, variously practical, stubborn, and possessed of an unusual tolerance for both cold mornings and the skepticism of their neighbors. The Dragon Warden's primary duty, as set out in the original charter that Lyra kept folded in the bottom of a cedar box under her bed, was to maintain peaceful relations between the town of Millhaven and the Dragon of Dandelion Hill, to perform monthly inspections of the creature's resting place, to record observations in the official log, and to serve as diplomatic intermediary should the dragon wake and wish to communicate. In practice, this meant that once a month, or once a year when the months ran busy, which was to say, whenever she remembered, Lyra walked up the hill, sat beside a dragon that had not moved in recorded history, wrote no change observed in a small leather book, and walked back down again. The town found this mildly entertaining. The children found it slightly more interesting than the bread blessing and slightly less interesting than anything involving horses. The new magistrate, a man named Aldrich Corin who had arrived from the eastern provinces 6 months prior with his ledgers and his ambitions and his deep personal conviction that anything not generating revenue was by definition generating waste, found it actively offensive. What exactly, he had said to Lyra at their first formal meeting, in a tone that suggested he had rehearsed this sentence, is the annual budget allocation for the Dragon Warden's office producing in return. Lyra had considered this. Peace, she said. Aldrich had written something in his ledger. She suspected it was not a complimentary notation. On the morning that the story truly begins, Lyra rose before the sun, not from diligence, exactly, but because she had slept badly, dreaming in that fragmented, unreliable way one does when something at the edge of consciousness has been attempting to get one's attention for some time without success. She could not recall the details of the dream. Only a color, a deep, slow amber, like the last light through autumn leaves, and a sound, low and resonant, that had less to do with hearing than with feeling, the way a cathedral bell is felt in the chest before it is understood by the ears. She dressed in the practical layers that the hill required in early spring, heavy wool, good boots, the long canvas coat that had belonged to her grandmother and smelled, still, after all these years, of something she could only describe as mountain and rain and considerable age. She took the log book from the cedar box. She made tea, drank half of it standing at the window watching the pre-dawn sky go from black to a luminous, uncertain gray, and then she walked out into the morning. Millhaven was quiet at this hour in the way that small towns are quiet, not absent, exactly, but tucked in. The baker's chimney already exhaled its warm, flowery breath. A cat of extraordinary orange sat on a fence post and regarded Lyra with the patient, faintly judgmental expression that cats reserve for people doing things that seem to the cat unnecessary. A dog barked once, somewhere behind the mill, then thought better of it. The road that led to Dandelion Hill was not much of a road. It had been a road once, you could tell by the way the stones were arranged, with that particular deliberateness that suggested human intention, but the dandelions had long since made significant territorial gains along its edges, and in certain places the path had been compressed to a single person's width, bordered on both sides by the tall, sturdy green stalks and their broad, golden crowns. Even now, in early spring, even in the thin and tentative light of this particular morning, there were dandelions. Lyra had marveled at this for years. In winter, when the rest of the valley was rigid with frost, the lower slopes of Dandelion Hill retained a faint warmth. The dandelions never entirely retreated. They simply went quieter, bowing their heads, waiting, as the dragon himself waited, for what, exactly, no one knew. The hill was not large by any dramatic measure. It would not have impressed a mountaineer. But it had a certain quality of presence, of standing slightly apart from the rest of the landscape, as though it existed according to its own principles. The valley flattened and spread in all directions around it, farmland and hedgerow and the winding silver thread of the river Mell, but the hill simply rose from the middle of all that practicality with an air of serene self-determination, as though it had declined to participate in the geography around it and had been humored. Lyra began to climb. The dragon was visible from perhaps halfway up, if you knew what you were looking for. Most visitors to the hill, and there were very few of those, it being the kind of place that people acknowledged with a nod from a distance but rarely approached, saw only a formation of stone and earth at the summit. A rocky outcropping, they told themselves. A curious geological feature. The mind, offered a sufficiently large and unfamiliar thing, will reach for a smaller, more manageable explanation. But Lyra had been coming here since she was 8 years old. She knew the shape of him the way one knows the shape of a sleeping body in the bed beside you, not by analysis, but by accumulated familiarity, by thousands of small observances compounded into something as automatic and unthinking as breathing. The ridge of his spine ran from northwest to southeast along the hill's crest, a long, irregular line that at a distance suggested a rock formation and at close range suggested something that had once moved through the world with extraordinary purpose. His wings, folded, compressed, pressed against the hill's surface as though he had lain down against it in exhaustion and simply stayed, were almost entirely covered in the turf of centuries. Grass and moss and root had grown over them. In another age, another 100 years perhaps, he might become entirely indistinguishable from the hill itself, which Lyra found herself feeling things about that she was not always prepared to examine. His head lay at the far northern end of the hill's crown, enormous and still, his great jaw resting on crossed forelimbs. His scales, where they were not covered, were the color of old bronze touched with verdigris, a deep, oxidized green gold that shifted almost imperceptibly with the light. A cluster of dandelions had taken root in the curve of his left ear. He wore them, Lyra had always thought, with a kind of accidental and unconscious dignity, the way very old things carry beauty without intending to. She reached the summit. The air was warmer here than it should have been. It was always warmer here than it should have been, and carried that faint quality she associated with proximity to the dragon and could not otherwise name. Alive. The word presented itself, as it always did, slightly improbably, to describe what was, to all appearances, a very large and very motionless arrangement of scales and stone. She opened the log book to the next blank page. She uncapped her pen. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she stopped and looked again. The dandelions in his ear were wrong. No, not wrong, exactly. But different. They were blooming. Not merely the ordinary blooming of dandelions at the end of their yellow phase, the slight puff of white seed head that preceded their dispersal. These dandelions were blooming, vivid, fully open, almost luminously gold, and they were doing so in perfect circular arrangement, each head precisely equidistant from its neighbors, each one angled slightly toward the center of the spiral they formed, as though arranged by careful hands. Lyra stared at them. The logbook, which had a long history of receiving the phrase "no change observed," received instead, on this morning, anomalous bloom pattern. Left ear flora. Circular formation, approximately 11 heads. Continuing observation. She sat beside him. She always sat beside him, on the broad, flat shoulder stone that had probably been some part of his dorsal ridge and was now smooth and warm from 1,000 visits, and she watched the dandelions for a long time. They did not move, except as the breeze moved them, all together, in the gentle, unconscious unison of things that do not think. But the warmth, she thought. The warmth was different today. Not greater, exactly, she would not have said it was hotter. But deeper. More present. The way of fire is different when the embers are still live beneath the ash. She stayed long past her usual quarter hour. She stayed until the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills and was laying its flat morning light across the valley in long, pale stripes. She stayed until the birds began to move in earnest, and the distant sounds of Millhaven's morning industriousness drifted up to her. Carts, voices, the rhythmic report of hammer on anvil from the smithy. She stayed because, for the first time in years of these visits, she did not want to leave. By the time Lyra descended and made her way to her grandmother's house on the town's eastern margin, The morning was well established and Lyra Voss was already at her kitchen table with a cup of something that steamed in a manner suggesting it had been there for some time and had developed opinions about the matter. Grandmother Thessaly was 91 years old and possessed of the particular quality of great age that passes beyond frailty into something that resembles, in its own oblique way, the solidity of stone. She was small and deeply lined and moved through the world at a pace that made no concessions to urgency, because in 91 years she had observed that urgency was, more often than not, a response to insufficient preparation. She kept an enormous gray cat named Burden, who lived on the windowsill and regarded visitors with an expression identical to the cat Lyra had passed on the fence post, suggesting either a conspiracy or a common disposition among the cats of Millhaven toward philosophical skepticism. "You've been up early," Thessaly said, without looking up from something she was peeling. "And you've been to the hill." Lyra sat down. "How do you know?" "You have that face." "Which face?" "The one that means the hill surprised you." Thessaly set down the peeling knife. She looked at Lyra with eyes that were still, after 9 decades, the particular pale gray of winter sky over open water, clear and deep and not unkind. "Tell me." Lyra described the dandelions. Thessaly listened without interrupting, which was itself notable, as Thessaly was not, as a general rule, given to patient silence. She listened, and the space around her listening was careful. When Lyra finished, Thessaly was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How warm was it?" "Warmer than usual." "Different." Lyra searched for the word. "The way coals are warm, not the way the sun is warm." Thessaly nodded once, slowly, in the manner of someone receiving a piece of information they had been both expecting and hoping not to receive. "Grandmother." What does it mean?" Thessaly picked up her cup. "Set it down again without drinking." "Get the box," she said. "The one in the back room. The big one, the brown leather one with the brass corners. It's on the shelf behind the winter blankets. You'll need to shift some things." "The box," Lyra said. "You've never let me into the back room." "No," Thessaly agreed. "But I think the time for that particular restraint has passed." She looked at Lyra steadily. "The dandelions do not bloom in circles by accident, child. They bloom in circles when something beneath the hill is beginning to rotate." "Rotate," Lyra repeated. "When the dreaming begins to shift." Thessaly's voice was very even. "When whatever dream has held him these 300 years begins, at last, to become insufficient." The kitchen was very quiet. Burden shifted on the windowsill, resettled, closed his eyes. "Go," said Tessely. "Fetch the box." The back room was the kind of room that accumulates rather than being arranged, a slow geological layering of a long life's acquisitions, things kept not because they were useful in any present sense but because they had been important, once, or might be, someday, or because the person who had given them had mattered and the objects retained, after a fashion, something of that mattering. Lyra moved carefully through it, reading the room the way one reads old handwriting, slowly, and with patience, looking for what lay beneath the surface flourish. The box was where Tessely said it would be. It was heavy, heavier than its size suggested it should be, and it was very old. The leather was dry and cracked in places along its seams, but the brass corners were surprisingly bright, and the clasp was a simple, functional mechanism that opened easily, as though it had been designed for eventual access rather than permanent concealment. Inside was paper. Not a neat stack of papers, organized and annotated and properly archival, but a layered, dense accumulation of documents, some loose, some folded, some bound in small packets with twine, some rolled and tied with ribbon that had once been red and was now a color beyond classification. There were pages of close, careful handwriting in multiple hands. There were pages of what appeared to be sketches, the hill, from various angles, at various seasons. There were pages of what appeared to be symbols Lyra did not recognize, recurring in different combinations across different documents in what might have been code, or notation, or language. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a square of old linen and tied with a piece of cord, was something flat and rigid. Lyra brought everything to the kitchen table. They spent the rest of that morning sorting. Tessely, who could read the old hands, began translating aloud as she went. Lyra wrote notes in the margins of her Dragon Warden log. By noon, they had assembled, piece by fragmentary piece, the outline of a story, and it was not the story that either of them had expected. The first Dragon Wardens, it seemed, the original holders of the role, in the generations before the charter had been written, before the charter had even been imagined, had not been ceremonial at all. They had been companions. The notice appeared on the market hall wall on a Thursday, a broad sheet of heavy paper, very official in its borders and its font and its use of the magistrate's seal, which depicted a pair of scales and a sheaf of grain and conveyed, through its sheer density of official imagery, the impression that disagreement would require considerably more effort than compliance. The notice proposed what it termed a development initiative for the northern quarter of Millhaven, specifically, a quarrying operation to extract the limestone deposits that had, according to the Geological Survey commissioned from the eastern provinces at what Aldrich had described to the town council as a very reasonable rate, been identified beneath and around Dandelion Hill. The limestone, the notice explained, would supply material for the road expansion currently planned by the Provincial Highway Authority. The quarrying operation would create employment for approximately 40 workers over a projected period of 3 to 5 years. The economic benefit to Millhaven would be, in the notice's precise language, considerable and compounding. The notice made no mention of the dragon. This was not, Lyra suspected, because Aldrich was unaware of the dragon. Aldrich was thoroughly aware of the dragon. Aldrich was, in fact, deeply aware of the dragon, in the way that one is deeply aware of a splinter that one has decided to deal with by simply refusing to acknowledge its existence until the wound either heals or becomes catastrophic. She presented herself at his office that same Thursday afternoon. Aldrich was at his desk, which was very large and very organized, the papers upon it arranged in a manner that communicated, through their precision, something about the degree to which their owner believed that the world responded to sufficient administrative order. The quarry proposal, Lyra said. The development initiative, Aldrich corrected pleasantly. He was not an unpleasant man, in himself. He was, in fact, quite reasonable on the subject of most things, pleasant at festivals, sensible about road maintenance, genuinely attentive to the concerns of the town's merchants. It was merely that his conception of the world was built on the unexamined assumption that problems could be resolved by categorizing them correctly and applying the appropriate procedure, and that the appropriate procedure was invariably the one he had already identified. The hill, Lyra said, is limestone, he said. And limestone is resource. There is a dragon on the hill. There is a geological formation on the hill, Aldrich said, that the town has, through an excess of tradition and perhaps a deficit of rational inquiry, chosen to categorize as a dragon. The Geological Survey, which was conducted by credentialed individuals from the Eastern Institute of Natural Philosophy, found no evidence of any living creature on or under the hill. He is sleeping, Lyra said. Things that have not moved in 3 centuries, Aldrich said, with a patience that was itself a form of condescension, are, by the generally accepted application of the word, not alive. Lyra thought about the warmth she had felt that morning. The warmth like deep coals. She thought about the dandelions in their perfect, considered spiral. She thought about what Tessely's documents had contained, and what she had not yet had time to fully read. I need 2 weeks, she said. Aldrich opened his ledger. Construction begins in 12 days. Then I need 12 days. He studied her across his very organized desk. The Dragon Warden, he said slowly, is a ceremonial title. The charter that created the position predates Millhaven's incorporation into the provincial authority by 60 years. Its legal standing in relation to approved development initiatives is a question I have already had reviewed by the provincial solicitor. And ambiguous, he admitted, which was, she suspected, more honest than he had intended to be. But not prohibitive. He closed the ledger. "You have 12 days, Warden. Bring me something substantive." She left without thanking him, which was perhaps impolite but felt accurate. She returned to Tessely's kitchen that evening and every evening for the next 4 days, and in that time she read everything in the box. The documents told a story in layers, the way old things often do, the later accounts more formal, more measured, more concerned with record-keeping and less with lived experience, while the earlier ones were personal and immediate and written in the kind of hand that moves quickly because the writer is trying to capture something before it slips away. The earliest document was the most arresting. It was written in a woman's hand, angular and forceful, clearly educated, clearly accustomed to writing but also clearly writing in haste or urgency, and its opening line read, "I am setting this down so that whoever comes after will not have to learn, as I did, through accident and fear, what the dragon of this hill is, and what was asked of him. His name was Sorrel." This was the first thing Lyra learned. In all the years she had been visiting the hill, all the no-change observed and the quiet morning sittings and the dandelion cataloguing, she had not known his name. The official charter referred only to the dragon of Dandelion Hill, as though a definite article and a geographic designation were introduction enough for something of his magnitude. But the original Dragon Wardens had known his name. The woman who had written the first document had known him, had spoken to him, regularly, before the sleep. Had, in fact, been with him when he made the choice to sleep. He had not always slept, the documents made clear. There had been a time, not so long ago, in the reckoning of things that live for centuries, when Sorrel had been present and awake and a known, if unusual, resident of the valley. He had not been a danger. Dragons, in the understanding of those who had actually known one, were not by their nature the catastrophic, gold-hoarding terrors of popular legend. They were old. They were intelligent. They were capable of grief in a proportion consistent with their scale, which was to say, very greatly. Sorrel had grieved. The documents were not entirely clear on the specifics. There were gaps, missing pages, passages that had been water-damaged into illegibility, but the shape of the story that emerged was this: Sorrel had been at the hill, in the valley, in communication with Millhaven and its surrounding settlements, for perhaps 200 years before the first Dragon Warden was appointed. He had been, in that time, a kind of presence, occasionally helpful, occasionally alarming, always unmistakably there. The valley's farmers had understood, empirically if not intellectually, that the warming radiating from the hill improved their growing season. The river ran clean along its stretch past the hill. The springs that originated on the hill's eastern slope provided the freshest water for miles. And then something had happened. The documents named it obliquely, the loss. Whatever it was, whoever it was, Sorrel had been altered by it in the way that profound loss alters all things that are capable of being altered. Which is to say, utterly, and in ways that could not be entirely undone. The original Dragon Warden, the woman who had written the first document, had been present for the year that followed the loss, and she wrote about it with the careful restraint of someone who understood that some things can be recorded but not adequately described. She had sat with Sorrel in his grief the way one sits with the grieving, present, quiet, providing the only thing that proximity can provide, evidence that one is not alone. And eventually, Sorrel had spoken to her. He told me, the document read, that he did not wish to leave the valley. That this place was the last place that held the shape of what he had lost, and he could not bring himself to depart from it. But that he also could not remain in it, not as he was, not in full consciousness. That consciousness, for him, had become a wound that would not close. That sleep was not defeat, but mercy, a mercy he was asking of himself. He asked if the valley would permit it. He asked if someone would stay. And so the bargain had been made. Not a dramatic, formal bargain, not the kind of bargain that required signatures and witnesses and official seals. A quiet bargain. The kind made between two parties who understand each other. Sorrel would sleep, and in sleeping he would continue to do what he had always done, warm the hill, feed the springs, hold the valley in the unconscious, peripheral care of something very large and very deep. And the valley would hold him in return. Would remember him. Would send someone, once in a while, simply to sit. That was all the Dragon Warden was ever supposed to do. Sit. Be company. Remind him, in whatever way sleeping things can be reminded, that he had not been forgotten. Lyra sat with this for a very long time after reading it. You knew, she said to Thessaly. I knew some of it, Thessaly said. Not all. Your great-great-grandmother knew more than she wrote down, I suspect. And your great-grandmother left most of it in the box without reading it, because she was a practical woman who found the sentimental aspects of the role easier to manage at a distance. She paused. I read it. All of it. Years ago. And I kept coming anyway. Why didn't you tell me? Thessaly looked at her. Because I needed you to come to the hill because you chose to. Not because you felt obligated to a story. Lyra thought about this. She thought about 8-year-old herself, her grandmother's hand around hers on the path, and the first time she had seen him, really seen him, understood the shape beneath the earth and moss. The feeling she had never been able to name but had kept returning to, year after year. Does the warming matter? she asked. The signs of stirring? In all my years, Thessaly said quietly, I never saw them. My mother never saw them. Her mother never saw them. He has not stirred in 300 years. She folded her hands on the table. Something has disturbed him. Or, Lyra said, something is ending. They looked at each other. The documents speak of it, Thessaly said. In the last pages, the ones written in the youngest hand. The last Dragon Warden before the role became ceremonial. She wrote that Sorrel had said, when he was still speaking, before the sleep fully took him, that the sleep had its own limits. That grief could sustain it for a time, but that grief was not, in the end, inexhaustible. What would happen when it ran out? He would wake, Thessaly said, and need to decide what to do with the waking. On the 6th day, Lyra discovered the notebooks at the bottom of the box, tucked under the folded linen, smaller than she had initially noticed, 3 of them, bound in soft brown leather with clasps of a simple, old design. The notebooks were Sorrel's. Not written by Sorrel, she did not think he had hands for it, nor would he have required a human instrument for a thing so transient as writing. But written from Sorrel, in the sense that the first Dragon Wardens had been, among their other quiet duties, recorders. They had sat beside him in the years before the deep sleep, in the years when he was present and awake and sometimes willing to speak, and they had written down what he said. It was not a complete record. There were long gaps, clearly, weeks or months between entries, the kind of gap that suggests either absence or the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. But what was there was extraordinary, and Lyra read it with the particular, focused quality of attention that one brings to something irreplaceable. He had spoken about time, often. About the difference between the way it moved for him and the way it moved for the short-lived, warm-blooded creatures of the valley. A century to you, one passage read, is everything, it is the entire canvas, the whole story. For me, a century is a chapter. A decade is a paragraph. And a single human life. There was a gap there, several lines crossed out, and then, and yet those small, brief lives are the ones I find myself remembering longest. Perhaps because they are so complete. A thing that has a clear ending has a clarity that things without endings sometimes lack. He had spoken about the hill. About the relationship between his own warmth and the warmth of the earth beneath him, a mutual thing, he seemed to suggest, not purely one direction. I did not make this place, he said, but I am, by now, part of what it is. The springs run from my breathing. The dandelions grow because the ground is warm. If I were not here, the valley would change, over time. Slowly. Not catastrophically, I am not so arrogant as to believe myself irreplaceable. But perceptibly. The way a voice changes a room, not by being loud, but simply by being present. And he had spoken, in the last notebook, in the entries just before the sleep, about the loss. He had spoken about it carefully, with a precision that Lyra recognized, in retrospect, as the precision of someone who has become very skilled at speaking about something that still carries the power to break them. The loss had been another dragon. That much was clear from the context, though no name was given. The original warden had been careful with this, understanding, perhaps, that some things should not be written plainly but should be left in the shape of their omission, like a shadow that tells you more about the light than any direct description could. What was clear was that it had been old, older than Sorrel, who was himself very old, and that it had been present in the valley for a time before moving on. Moving on, in this context, might mean departure, or might mean something more absolute. The documents did not specify. Sorrel had not specified, and the first Dragon Warden had respected what was not given to her to know. What he had said, though, in the very last entry, the last thing written before the deep sleep took him, was this: I have been thinking about the difference between rest and retreat. For a long time, I believed I was choosing the latter and trying to persuade myself it was the former. I think I have finally understood the distinction. Retreat is a response to defeat. Rest is a response to the ordinary, necessary limits of what any living thing can hold. I am very old, and I have held a great deal. The sleep is not surrender. It is the right and reasonable setting down of a weight that has been carried long enough for one season. I intend to be here, when I am ready to be here again. I would simply prefer to be somewhere quieter than consciousness, in the meantime. Lyra read this 3 times. She thought about the quarry. She thought about Aldrich's ledger and his geological survey and his 12 days. And she thought about the spiral of dandelions, luminous and precise, in the curve of an enormous ear, a bloom pattern that had not appeared in 300 years of recorded observation. Whatever was ending, it was ending now. On the 9th day, the survey crew arrived. They were 5 men from the eastern provinces, practical, methodical, possessed of an array of instruments that Lyra could not name and an attitude toward the local landscape that suggested they had not been briefed on anything that could not be measured with those instruments. They set up at the base of the hill's northern slope and proceeded to do the things that survey crews do: driving stakes, running lines, taking notes, speaking to each other in the shorthand of a shared technical vocabulary. One of them walked up the hill. He did not go all the way to the top. He stopped about 3/4 of the way up, made some notations, tapped a stake into the ground with a small hammer, and walked back down. The tap of the stake, at that distance, was barely audible. Lyra, watching from the path, felt it regardless, not in her ears, exactly. In some other, less nameable place. She went to Aldrich. "The survey crew is on the hill," she said. "Their job is to survey," he said. "It would be difficult to survey the hill without going on it. The process of drilling and blasting for a limestone quarry," Lyra said carefully, "requires the detonation of explosive charges at depth. It is, by any measurement, the most significant and most physically violent thing that has been done to or near that hill in all recorded history." Aldrich looked at her with the measured patience he consistently brought to conversations about the hill. "You have 3 days remaining," he said. "What substantive case are you building?" She told him about the documents. She told him about the notebooks. She told him, carefully, clearly, with the considered precision of someone who understood that her credibility was the only tool she had, what sorrel was, what the sleep was, what the warming meant. Aldrich listened. He was genuinely listening, she could tell. His attention had a quality of honest engagement that she had to respect, even as she understood that what she was describing was, for him, categorically incompatible with the world as he understood it to function. "You're describing," he said, when she finished, "a living creature that has not moved in 300 years, based on documents written by people who believed, in an era before systematic natural inquiry, that it was a living creature." "I'm describing a creature that is waking," Lyra said. "The signs are not historical. They are happening now. Today. Flowers blooming in an unusual pattern. And warmth that has increased measurably over the past 9 days. She had been tracking it every morning. She had numbers. She set them in front of him." Aldrich looked at the numbers. He was not a dishonest man, and the numbers were difficult to dispute. "Geothermal activity," he said, but there was the faintest uncertainty in it now. "That is what it is," Lyra agreed. "It is geothermal. But the geothermal activity is his breathing." She did not convince him. She had not expected to entirely convince him. What she had hoped for was a delay, 2 weeks, a month, enough time for something definitive to happen or not happen, enough time for the hill to declare itself clearly enough that even Aldrich's methodology would have to account for it. She did not get the delay. What she got, on the 10th day, was a knock at her door at 6 in the morning. It was Pip Warwick, the miller's son, 12 years old, with his father's wide-set eyes and his own particular quality of alert attentiveness, the quality that makes certain children seem, in their observation of the world, more present than the adults around them. "There's something wrong with the hill," he said. He was out of breath. He had been running. "What have you seen?" she said, and was pulling on her coat before she had finished asking. "It's the dandelions," he said. "All of them. All the way up." She went. He ran beside her, matching her pace with the easy energy of the very young. The dandelions were not in spiral formation. Not exclusively. They were all blooming, every one of them, from the base of the hill to the crown, in the cold April morning, in the thin gray hour before full sun, blazing gold. Not the pale, tentative gold of dandelions in ordinary spring light. A deep, vivid, fully saturated gold that seemed to hold light rather than merely reflect it. The entire hill glowed. And the warmth. It hit her at the base of the hill, not the background warmth she was accustomed to, not the subtle warmth of a sleeping thing, but something with perceptible force, something that arrived like the warmth from a hearth when a door is opened. She looked at Pip. He looked at her. "You should stay here," she said. "Not a chance," he said. She decided not to argue. He came. They were halfway up the hill when they heard it for the first time. It was not a sound, exactly. It was closer to what the last warden had written about in the first notebook, a thing felt in the chest, low and resonant, like the aftershock of a very large bell. It came from the hill itself, or from beneath it, or from the thing that was the hill and the thing beneath it simultaneously. It came at irregular intervals, not rhythmic, but recurring. The intervals were shortening. "Breathing," Pip said, "barely audible." "Yes," Lyra said. They climbed. The summit, when they reached it, was warm as high summer. The dandelions there were extraordinary, so densely blooming, so intensely golden, that they formed something approaching a carpet of pure color, and walking through them was like walking through visible light. They reached Lyra's knees. They brushed Pip's hands where he held them out at his sides, the seed heads of the older ones bursting at his passage into long, lazy spirals of white that drifted in the warm, still air. The dragon had not risen. He was not standing, not rearing, not doing any of the things that stories about waking dragons generally involved. But he was no longer still. The change was subtle, so subtle that someone who had not spent years beside him might have missed it entirely. But Lyra did not miss it. The angle of his jaw against his forearms was different. His head had shifted, not dramatically, not the inches of inches one might expect, but with the slow, deliberate quality of something that has made a decision that has not yet been fully implemented. And along the ridge of his spine, where the grass had grown thick and deep over centuries of accumulation, there were places where the turf had cracked. Long, fine cracks, like the first fissures in a pavement bearing new weight. The muscles beneath them, if muscles was the right word for something so ancient, were shifting. His eyes were closed. They were still closed. But his breath, now fully audible, now unmistakable, a deep, slow exhalation that moved the dandelions in a wide circle around his head, was the breath of something that was no longer entirely sleeping. Lyra walked to him. To the smooth shoulder stone, where she had sat 100 times, in all weathers, in all her states of mind. She sat down. "Hello, Sorrel," she said. The name felt strange and right simultaneously, strange because she had never used it before, right because it was his, and because she was holding the notebooks in her coat pocket, and because there are moments in which formality becomes not a courtesy but a failure of nerve. Nothing happened immediately. She had not expected it to. She sat. She breathed. She watched the cracked turf along his spine and the spiraling seed heads of dandelions drifting upward in the warm air like small, uncomplicated intentions releasing themselves from the ground. Pip sat on the grass 10 feet away, cross-legged, watching with his wide-set eyes and his expression of careful, serious attention. The temperature continued to rise, slowly. And then the sound changed. The long, deep exhalation that had been his breath shifted, not louder, but more complex, more layered, as a chord is more than its component notes. It became the sound of an enormous thing changing states. Of something that had been very, very still beginning, in some deep and fundamental register, to move. Lyra's hands were flat on the shoulder stone. She kept them there. She did not stand. She did not back away. She remained exactly where she was, and she said his name again, quietly. Sorrel. And the great eye on the near side of his head, the eye she had sat beside for years, the eye that had been closed so completely and for so long that the crease of it had its own small ecology of moss and root, that I opened. It was amber. The color she had dreamed in that week ago, the deep, slow amber of the last light through autumn leaves. It was also larger than she had fully prepared herself for, which was a thing she noted with a corner of her mind that was still engaged in the business of rational observation even as the rest of her mind was doing something else entirely, something closer to awe. The iris was vertical, elongated, ringed with deep gold at its outer edge. The pupil, adjusting to the morning light, contracted slowly, because everything about him was slow, because 3 centuries of sleep was not undone in an instant, because waking, for something as large and as old as sorrel, was not an event but a process, and the process was not yet complete, but it had begun, it was beginning. And the beginning of it was the opening of one ancient amber eye on a hill of blazing gold dandelions in the young April morning. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved. And then, from somewhere inside the enormous chest, in a register so low it was felt more than heard, came the first word. Warden. The word was not human. Not exactly. It carried the quality of very deep places and very long times, a sound that borrowed human language the way a river borrows a bank, using it, shaped by it, but not contained by it. It moved through the air and through the ground simultaneously. Pip made a small, involuntary sound. He did not run. He had the kind of courage that consists less of fearlessness than of fascinated commitment, the courage of someone who understands that this moment, whatever it is the kind that one does not get more than once. Yes, Lyra said. Her own voice, by comparison, was a very small thing. I'm the Dragon Warden of Millhaven. Another long breath. Another slow pulse of warmth. How long? Sorrel said, and the two words alone were an entire question, and she understood it without elaboration. How long have I been sleeping? How long since the last proper waking? How long since the world outside the dream? 308 years, she said. That we have in the records. It may be longer. The amber I was very still. Processing, perhaps. Or simply resting in the knowledge. Much, he said, eventually, has changed. Yes, she said. And much has stayed the same. The hill is still here. The valley. The river. She paused. The dandelions. Something moved in the amber depths, not quite humor, but its older, larger relative. The dandelions, he agreed, and it was almost, something like a gentle inflection. You know why you woke? She asked. She wanted to be careful here. She wanted to be present and attentive, and she wanted to let him lead, because he was the one who had just returned from 3 centuries of dreaming, and whatever he needed from this first conversation was more important than anything she needed from it. Something is different, he said. In the ground. A disturbance. Shallow. A pause. Human-made. There's a man, Lyra said. A magistrate. He wants to quarry the hill. The air changed. She would not have said the temperature changed, it was already warm. But the quality of the warmth shifted, the way the quality of a room changes when the person in it has received information they were not prepared for. He doesn't know what you are, she added quickly. Or he doesn't believe it. He's from a city. He's used to a world that can be measured. She considered. He is not a bad man. He is a man who has learned a particular way of being in the world that doesn't have room in it for you. Many such men, Sorrel said. The words were not bitter. They were simply old and accurate. Many, she agreed. A long silence. She heard the town below, distant, the morning beginning in earnest now, the sounds of Millhaven's ordinary industry carried up on the warm air in small pieces. She thought about the 11 days, and the survey stakes, and the way Aldrich had looked at her numbers with that flicker of uncertainty. "Are you in pain?" she asked. It was not the diplomatic question. It was not the question she had planned to ask. But it was the question that mattered. The silence that followed was longer than the others. "No," Sorrel said, eventually. "Not as I was." She understood this was not a simple answer, and did not push it. She sat beside him, in the warmth, in the golden field of dandelions, in the breathing presence of something 300 years older than her oldest records. "The notebooks," she said. "Your words. The Dragon Wardens kept them. I've read them." A long pause. Then, "Which words?" "The ones about time. About what it means to rest." She hesitated. "The ones about the distinction between retreat and rest." Another silence. Something in the amber eye shifted, not away from her, but somewhere inward, the way eyes move when memory is reached for. "You are not the first warden to read them," he said. "No. But I'm the one who needed them this week." "Are you also, small person, in difficulty?" And there was something in the way he said it, small person, that was not diminishment but was its opposite. The tenderness of the very large toward the very small, which is different in quality from the tenderness of equals. "Yes," she said, honestly. "My town is going to drill into your hill in 3 days, and I don't know how to stop it. I have an argument and I don't know if it's sufficient. And the person I have to convince is rational, which makes it harder, because rationality is a method, and methods can't always be persuaded by things that exist outside their parameters." The ground moved, very slightly. An adjustment of weight, a settling. The cracks along the spine widened marginally. The hillside exhaled. "Bring him," Sorrel said. Lyra blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The magistrate. Bring him to the hill." A pause, weighted with something that was, she thought, the dragon's equivalent of dry humor. "I suspect I am sufficiently within his parameters." She went down the hill. She left Pip, who had not moved from his cross-legged position, had in fact spent the entire conversation in a state of concentrated silence that she found profoundly endearing, she left Pip with precise instructions: do not touch anything, do not move any closer, and if the situation changes in any way that seems urgent, run and find me. What counts as urgent? Pip asked. You'll know, she said. She went to Aldrich's office. He was there, already, at his organized desk, with his ledger open and his cup of something cooling at his elbow. The dragon, she said, would like to speak with you. Aldrich looked up from his ledger. He's awake, she said. He woke this morning. He's on the hill. He would like to have a conversation with you before your survey crew begins operations. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. His expression was doing several things simultaneously: the administrative competence, the rational methodology, and, beneath them, something that she was privately glad to see: honest uncertainty. The acknowledgement, even if he could not yet fully articulate it, that the situation may have moved outside his prepared responses. The dragon, he said, is speaking. Yes. And requesting a meeting. Yes. Aldrich closed his ledger. He stood. He reached for his coat, which was hanging on a hook by the door, and he put it on with the deliberate motions of a man maintaining composure. I'll need my notebook, he said. The walk up the hill was unlike any walk Lyra had made up it before. Aldrich was silent, genuinely, pensively silent, not the polite silence of a man waiting to speak, but the silence of a man observing and adjusting. He noted the warmth. He noted the dandelions, all of them, blazing gold in the noon light now, the hillside a color that had no adequate precedent in his administrative experience. He noted the cracks in the turf along what he had previously catalogued as a geological formation. He did not say anything until they reached the summit, and then what he said was, I see. It was not an admission. It was not a capitulation. But it was an honest 2 words from a man who had been, until this morning, operating on the assumption that the category of things that exist had firm and charted boundaries. Sorrel's eye was open. The same amber, the same magnitude, now with the addition of full morning light illuminating it more fully, which had the effect of making the experience both more beautiful and more absolutely vertiginous. Aldrich stopped walking about 10 feet from the shoulder stone. He did not visibly tremble, which Lyra considered a point in his favor. Magistrate, Sorrel said. Aldrich's jaw tightened briefly. Then, that's correct. A pause. Good morning. Whatever Sorrel thought of this, and Lyra would have given a great deal to know, he did not express it. He had been awake for approximately 4 hours, which in his own temporal register was perhaps equivalent to the first few disoriented seconds after a long sleep, and he was conducting himself with a dignity she found humbling. "Your intentions for this hill," Sorrel said. It was not quite a question. Aldrich cleared his throat. "The limestone deposits beneath it are part of me," Sorrel said. "Not aggressive, not threatening. Simply accurate, in the way that factual things are accurate. As the warmth is part of me. As the springs. As the particular qualities of the soil that make the dandelions grow as they do." A long breath. "I have been here longer than your town. Longer than your province. Longer than the language you are speaking." Aldrich was quiet. "I am not," Sorrel said, "asking you to fear me. I am asking you to understand something that your instruments are not well designed to measure. Which is that this hill is not an independent geological feature. It is a living place. Because I am in it." "You were sleeping," Aldrich said. To his credit, he was still engaged, still trying to find the rational framework that would accommodate what was in front of him. "Yes," Sorrel said. "The sleep of grief is a kind of living. The sleep of choice is a kind of living. The question of whether something is alive is sometimes answered by the instruments, and sometimes by the consequences of removing it." A pause. "If you take the limestone, the springs will diminish. The warmth will diminish. The valley will change. Not immediately. Slowly. Over the generations it takes your kind to forget what was. What I am asking," Sorrel said, "is not for perpetual protection. I am old enough to know that nothing is perpetual. I am asking for the consideration that one applies to things that are alive and that have meaning, even when they are inconvenient. I am asking for the honest acknowledgement that the word resource is a word that applies to things that exist for the benefit of the party naming them, and that this hill did not come into being for your benefit or anyone else's benefit, but simply because the world is old and full of things that precede your ability to categorize them." The noon light was full and clear. The dandelions moved softly in a breeze that was warm and carried, somewhere in it, the faint and wholly improbable scent that Lyra had been trying to name for years, the scent of deep time, of the earth's own breath, of something that had no name in her language because her language had not been around long enough to need it. Aldrich stood very still for a long moment. Then he took out his notebook. He opened it. He wrote something. He looked up. "I'll need to present this to the provincial authority," he said. "They won't simply take my word for it." "Bring them," Sorrel said. "I will be here." "The survey will pause," Aldrich said. He said it as though he were making a decision in his ledger, precisely, formally, committing it to a record. Until this is resolved properly. Lyra breathed. Sorrel's eye, for just a moment, moved to her. The amber light in it held something she recognized, from the notebooks, from the old documents, from the careful and restrained language of people trying to record something that exceeded their vocabulary: acknowledgement, gratitude, the particular quality of being seen. "Thank you," she said to him. "Not for the meeting. For waking. For being still here, after everything." "Thank you, Warden," he said. And this time there was no question that it was more than a title. The provincial authority arrived 2 weeks later. There were 7 of them, and they brought with them a natural philosopher, a historian, and a surveyor, and between the 3 of them and Sorrel they had 3 days of conversation that Lyra observed from the shoulder stone with something approaching reverence. She did not record all of it in the Dragon Warden's log. Some of it belonged to those who had spoken it and to no one else. What she recorded was the outcome. Dandelion Hill was reclassified. The official document that emerged from the provincial authorities' deliberations was a remarkable piece of bureaucratic creativity. It had been written, clearly, by people who were trying to accommodate within a legal framework something that the legal framework had not been designed to accommodate. It designated the hill as a protected natural and living heritage site, a classification that had not previously existed and was created specifically for this occasion, and which carried with it the weight of provincial law and the prohibition of any extractive, disruptive, or otherwise invasive activity within a defined boundary. Aldrich, to his credit, had been the one to propose the classification. He had sat in the meeting with the provincial authority and he had spoken about what he had heard on the hill, and he had done so clearly and honestly and without the kind of qualification that would have allowed the authority to dismiss it. "I am a man of method," he had said, according to the account the historian later wrote, "and my method has always been to follow evidence. The evidence is this: something is alive on that hill, and it is intelligent, and it has been there longer than anything else in this valley. My method does not allow me to proceed as though that is irrelevant." Lyra had not expected to admire Aldrich. She found that she did. The natural philosopher spent an additional week on the hill, with Sorrel's permission, and wrote a paper that caused considerable controversy in the Eastern Institute and was, for the next decade, either celebrated or dismissed depending on the reader's fundamental orientation toward things that could not be measured without first being believed. Pip returned to the hill every afternoon for the duration of those weeks and sat in his cross-legged position with his wide-set attentive eyes and said very little, which Sorrel appeared to find acceptable and perhaps restful. On the 4th visit, Sorrel said to Pip, "You have questions." And Pip said, "I always have questions." And Sorrel said, "Ask them." And what followed was the longest continuous conversation between the dragon and any human in 300 years, about stars, and about how deep the earth went, and about whether fish knew they were in water, and about what a dream felt like from the inside when the inside was very large. Lyra wrote down as much of it as she could, and the notebook she filled became the first new addition to the cedar box in a generation. On the last night of the provincial authorities' visit, a soft night in late April, warm as early summer, the valley laid out below the hill in the blue-gray of settled dark. Sorrel and Lyra sat together in the way they had sat for years, the way she had always sat, on the smooth flat stone, in the warmth, in the quiet. "You'll go back," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. She had known. She had known from the notebooks, from the last entry, "The sleep is not surrender," and she had understood from the moment she had first seen the waking signs that this was not a permanent emergence. He had woken because the hill had been threatened. He had woken because it was time to do what the sleep had never quite been intended to do permanently, which was speak for himself. He had woken because, after 3 centuries, the grief had reached the place the notebook had described, where it was no longer inexhaustible, where its edges had worn into something that could be held rather than suffered. But he was still old. Still immeasurably tired, in the deep and fundamental way of things that have lived through more than any mind is designed to hold. "The hill will be safe," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Because of you." She shook her head. "You would have woken when they drilled. That would have been sufficient." "Perhaps," he said. "But you chose to understand before the crisis required understanding. That is different." Another pause. "There have been many Dragon Wardens who sat on this stone. I am aware of them, in the way one is aware of recurring presences in a long dream. You are the first in a very long time who came with the intention to know me rather than merely to fulfill a function." Lyra sat with this for a long time. The lights of Millhaven below were warm in the dark. Tessely's house, if she looked for it, was the small orange square at the town's eastern edge, a candle in the window, as it always was, as it had always been. "Will you dream?" she asked. "Yes." "What will you dream about?" The warmth pulsed, slow and deep. The dandelions, in the dark, were silver now, a whole hillside of silver, moonlit and quiet, each head bowed in the closing of the day. "I think," Sorrel said, and the words came slowly, as though chosen from a very long shelf of possible words, "I will dream about this. About this particular season, and the quality of the light on the hill at noon. About the boy with his questions. About the magistrate who was honest despite himself." A pause. About a dragon warden who came in early spring and said my name for the first time in 300 years. Lyra put her hand flat on the stone. It was warm. It had always been warm, and she had always known it, and she understood it now in a way she had not understood it before, not as geothermal phenomenon, not as geological curiosity, but as the simple, constant, outward evidence of a life. Something very large and very old, breathing. "I'll come back," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll be here. And I'll bring the boy." The sound that came in response to this was, in all the years she would talk about this night, and she would talk about it for the rest of her life, to Pip, to Thessaly, to her own children when she had them, to the people of Millhaven who slowly, generation by generation, came to understand what they lived beside. The sound that came in response to this was the closest thing to a laugh that she ever heard from Sorrel. It was low, and warm, and brief, and it moved through the ground and through the air and through her in a way that settled something, deeply, permanently, in the place where anxiety lives. She stayed beside him until she felt, rather than heard, the long slow deceleration of his breathing. Not the waking breath, not the deep, forceful exhalation of return. This was the settling of something going down again, going under, going back to where it had been, but different now. Not the sleep of escape. The sleep of a thing that has attended to what needed attending, and is choosing, with full awareness and some satisfaction, to rest. The dandelions were still when she finally rose and walked down the hill. What Millhaven came to know, in the years that followed, was not the dramatic mythology of dragons and danger and breathtaking confrontation. That version existed, the provincial historian's account was widely read, and the natural philosopher's paper, eventually, gained its vindication, but the version that the town held closest to itself was quieter. The hill was the hill. It was warm, and the dandelions were gold, and the springs ran clean and cold, and the warmth of the valley was better than the warmth of surrounding regions, and the growing season was generous, and these were simply facts about the place where they lived, ordinary facts that had accumulated around an extraordinary center the way ordinary life always accumulates around extraordinary centers. Because the extraordinary is, by its nature, the kind of thing that most of existence happens beside, rather than inside. There was a Dragon Warden. There had always been one. There always would be. Her name was Lyra Voss, and she walked up the hill once a month, and she sat beside a sleeping dragon on a warm stone in a field of dandelions, and she wrote in the log book, and sometimes she brought Pip, who was growing into a young man with wide-set eyes and a notebook of his own that was slowly filling with things Sorrel had said. She wrote many things in the log over the years that followed. She wrote about seasons and about the dandelions and about the small, incremental changes in the topography that she learned to read as weather is read, not with alarm, but with attentiveness, the attentiveness of someone responsible for something they love. She wrote, occasionally, about the quality of the warmth. It was, she wrote, on one of the last pages she would fill before the log was full and a new one was required. It was the warmth of someone sleeping deeply and well. The warmth of something that has set down a long-held weight and found the setting down of it to be, despite everything, a relief. The warmth of a creature that is dreaming in amber, somewhere beyond the reach of grief or season, in a place where time is not an urgency but a country, and the dreaming goes on as long as the dreaming wants to. She had been afraid, once, that the hill's warmth would cool. That something in the waking and returning had diminished him in some irreparable way. It had not. If anything, she wrote this last, and meant it, if anything, it was warmer now. The dandelions bloomed gold. The springs ran clear. The hill was warm. And at its summit, something ancient breathed in and out, in the slow and patient rhythm of everything that has chosen, wisely, to rest. And that, my dear dreamers, is where we leave them. Sorrel on his hill. Lyra on her stone. The dandelions, always, always the dandelions, gold and silver and breathing. I hope this story has done what the best stories do at this particular hour. Not just entertained you. Not just carried you somewhere beautiful. But left you with something to carry back, some small thought, perhaps, about the things we mistake for monuments when they are, in fact, lives. About the wisdom of rest that is chosen rather than forced. About what it means to sit beside something enormous and say, I know you are here. I have come to be here too. There is, I think, a sorrel in every life. Something old and large and quietly warming. Something we have been trained to categorize as landscape and have forgotten to call by its name. Tonight, perhaps, you know yours. If this episode found its way to you at the right time, I'm glad of it. If you'd like to support what we do here at Sleepy Story Haven, the storytelling, the curation, the quiet hours we build together, you'll find the links in the description. Everything you give goes back into this space, and I am grateful for every single one of you who chooses to spend these hours here. Sleep well, my dear dreamers. Dream warmly. I'll be here when you return.